for having me present today. The overall message is really the impact you can have by sort of addressing the dissemination and the implementation problem is far greater than you can sort of have in any other form of research. We have such an issue with having research sitting and new innovations and even policies and guidelines sitting and not actually being implemented into practice. So at a population level, the impact is huge of what we can do by actually researching and addressing the implementation problem. And that's starting to become much more of a focus across, policymakers themselves realising this and funders and things. I was very excited to see, I saw a RSVP list, and it was a very diverse audience here. We have, I think, about half researchers and half people who are actually sort of either purveyors of specific evidence-based practices or at policy level, or some people who actually do funding themselves. So that's fantastic. It's also a bit of a challenge as far as presenting and making it relevant to everyone. So all I can do in this time is really introduce some of the concepts of implementation, and then if any of them sort of spark interest, which I hope they will, we can obviously start the conversation and do more around specific study designs or specific outcomes, for example, or whatever sort of is of interest. I'm guessing from you guys being here, you probably have actually heard of implementation science in some form. And I was thinking, why is this? Why is it suddenly that people have heard of this? What's been the shift for us to think about implementation? And it's because now funders are expecting impact. They're not just wanting innovation, they're actually wanting to see results. But the problem is that research takes a long time. This is the traditional pipeline, as they sort of would call it, and it's been reported a lot that this takes around 17 years as an average. It can be a lot longer to go from sort of basic science to human clinical research to practice-based research to getting it even into practice. And that doesn't really even include getting into practice at scale, scaling up across populations. And that's still, it's a long trajectory. So what we're trying to do is reduce the time that it takes for things to get into practice and also increase the degree at which it is getting into practice. So to do this, we need to speed things up. And I'm walking here about social media and how, it's difficult to be involved, but implementation actually is a thing, the hashtag inside. There's a lot of really useful information actually that they're very big on Twitter. So actually to encourage you looking at Twitter if you're interested in implementation, because when the articles and things come out, they're very active on there. So science is constantly evolving. Over time, methods do change. We're trying to now have sort of rapid cycling of testing. Technology is changing so fast. If we were to do a traditional RCT in some ways, it's going to be outdated before you've got your results. So we're having to change methods. Theories are constantly evolving, and we have to sort of change with this. So policymakers and providers, they're demanding useful results. They're not wanting it just in scientific journals, as Simon was saying. They're wanting things summarised. They're wanting synopses and guidelines. They want it to be pragmatic, that it's practical, that it's feasible, that people can actually do it in practice. We're not developing something that is not implementable. So can it be done? What you've designed, does it have to be changed when it's put into practice? Because then you're going to get the outcomes they actually tested initially anyway. So it has to be thought about that it's feasible. And part of that is having the right stakeholders at the table from the beginning. Obviously that's reliable and valid, so there's quality measures in there. And it's acceptable and appropriate to the stakeholders. So we need to look at different aspects of things when we're developing them, so the policymakers and the users at the end are happy with the results. So the next 40 minutes or so, briefly sort of my background, introduction to the concepts of implementation science, and then hopefully we'll still have time to get about how we can incorporate them into your projects, whether that's a research project or an actual implementation project out in practice. So I'm a pharmacist by profession. I did my bachelor here at Curtin, then worked in community pharmacy relatively briefly before going to the UK and working in medical information. Moved back to Australia to Sydney and started working for our professional society doing continued education, conferencing and trying to get some evidence into practice through often our traditional methods of giving a workshop or a lecture and thinking, go off and do that now. Still often how professional societies work, because it does make sense, but change involves a lot more than just one-off lecture, for example. This is really what you can use something like this for, is just to spark an interest, and then you have to have quite a detailed program normally to have someone have behavioural organisational change. That led me on to a PhD, although it took quite a long time to be convinced into doing research, because I actually preferred application. I wanted to actually go out and do things. But the idea of implementation research was enough to spark my interest of how we can actually take things and put it into practice and be like that bridge between the two. So I did that between UTS in Sydney and the University of Granada in Spain, for about 2 years at each. And primarily the time in Spain was actually developing an implementation project for the first service in their community pharmacy sector. So that was sort of applying, while I was doing my PhD, but it was applying some of the principles that I was learning through my PhD. From there, I was, the whole time when I've been interested in sort of public health, and specifically the implementation, it really sparked an interest. So I did a postdoc at the University of California, San Diego, under one of the leading implementation researchers, which is Professor Greg Ahrens and his team. And I was in the Department of Psychiatry there, although, like often with implementation researchers at this stage, we sort of sit at the side of whichever department we're in. There's some really good groups developing, but we were sort of off campus as a research group. And the other thing with implementation is it's a diverse, often group of people, primarily clinical psychologists, but also industrial organisational psychology has got a big part to play in implementation. There's anthropologists and sociologists in the team there as well. A lot of the research, and I saw, I think, from one of the doors here, there's an autism research group here, in that there was a few different groups within our research group, some of them doing research around child and adolescents and autism, and then we were primarily in sort of social services, so implementation into juvenile justice, social child welfare, and our program was in substance use treatment centres, which I'll sort of explain from the time at the end. So projects at the moment, or acronyms, so the one that's ongoing that I was doing for my postdoc was the LOSI, which was a leadership and organisational change for implementation study. So it was a pure implementation study, testing whether or not a webinar to improve leadership skills was inferior to more intense leadership training. So we had a year-long program where I was a leadership coach trying to improve the transformational and the implementation leadership of managers of substance use treatment centres. And the hypothesis being that you needed to improve leadership and the climate in those centres for the actual counsellors and staff to be able to implement motivational interviewing. So the intervention we're trying to implement was motivational interviewing, but we weren't testing. There's a lot of evidence behind motivational interviewing, or seeing or coding the counsellors and making sure that it was in practice. We weren't testing patient outcomes at the end. We were looking at, did the leadership improve, and was that linked with how much they were doing motivational interviewing at the end? So that's sort of the distinction with pure implementation research and sort of effectiveness or clinical effectiveness research. ICAM in Switzerland is around implementing case management into emergency departments, so to try to reduce the number of frequent flyer, as they call it, to connect them into the healthcare system. And the last one has just been funded, which is a measure for inner context sustainment. So in the US, they do have a funding stream now specific for dissemination and implementation research. So they're a bit more down that line. I think here we still need sort of more of a hybrid sort of design if we're to be funded for implementation. Whereas there, we've got funding just to develop a measure to show if something is being sustained in practice. So that's where we're doing there through rash analyses. Proposed, so with SIGN we put in a proposal for pharmacy interventions for naloxone scale-up here, so hoping here in the next couple of months whether we can have that. So when, combining pharmacy and implementation, I'm coming back to school of pharmacy here. Together with Monash University, we put in a project for opioid use disorder and integrated model of care, having pharmacists more involved in that process of stuff like the CPOP program, but actually having them be able to work in the GP practices doing that. WeCare is around implementing a hypertension-based mobile app in Tibet, and I'm just a consultant around trying to scale that up in the implementation aspect. And also mindfulness as medicine put in a proposal for, which is pharmacy trying to, that one's not as much implementation, it's more around feasibility and still effectiveness. So hybrid design, looking at is mindfulness effective to reduce the stress of pharmacists in their setting. So that's what's on the card. There's sub-projects, and I'll put in examples as well as we go through, but that's sort of my background of research, but from here on it's more around introducing then implementation science to the concepts of what that is. So why it's important, what's the challenge, what is it, the terminology. Terminology is something that can be very confusing initially when reading implementation articles because there's a lot of crossover. Like any new field, that's an issue, trying to determine what kind of terminology and definitions for things are. What are like actual research questions for implementation? There's over 100 frameworks, models and theories now. Originally I had slides on a lot of them, and obviously that's not possible to cover them, but I'll show you a list, and then depending on what you're interested in, there's a lot of information on all the different ones. And then project design. So we know we've got this huge population with sort of AOD sort of problems, and it's at the moment we're looking at, very roughly from this actually US, around 50% are actually receiving treatment at all. So access to treatment is one of the priorities in Australia and in the US as first step. But even sort of maybe more concerning problem is those that are receiving treatment. How many of them are receiving acceptable care, and how many within that, is it based on evidence or is it based on their own sort of experiences? Now we know evidence-based care is 3 pillars of evidence plus people's experience and the patient's own choices. The evidence-based care is not just a one-pillar thing. But US anyway, and there was a study in Australia saying it was only 57% that received quality care, so we're very similar. Evidence-based care, it's pretty sad that only 15% are receiving that roughly at the moment, and maybe only 50% are receiving care at all. So that's, like I was saying at the beginning, there's such a potential for implementation, for impact, and that's what the postgraduate are wanting now is real impact. And so with using sort of implementation science and actually showing outcomes, because there's measures for some of these things now, you can design things around trying to just increase what is already evidence-based out in practice. Just a fun example of why people don't like change and why it is hard to get there is, this is the keyboard we use at the top here. This one, the QWERTY keyboard, QWERTY at the top there, it's called. Now, 1843 this was developed, designed, and that was because typewriters stuck. It was typewriting time and they stuck, so it couldn't be, they had to slow down the speed at which people could type so that typewriters wouldn't stick. So in 1932, they developed a far more efficient keyboard. This was, I can't remember exactly the percentage of how much more efficient, but it's highly more efficient, of using this. It's never been implemented, it's never been taken up by people. We still use the old keyboard because people don't like to change. And so the problem of change, the problem of implementation, it crosses all sectors. It's no different. The principles are sort of the same, but it is very, context is very, very important for an actual implementation. You must think about that. But the reason why is that change is very difficult and it involves change across multiple reasons and levels to how people do it. So here we have something new. We have an innovation or an intervention. If this is not effective, it doesn't mean it's not going to be implemented. If it's implemented and effective, you're still going to end up with poor outcomes. But really, to have actual benefits, you need both effective implementation and an effective intervention. And without the other, you're not going to have outcomes. So we can do all we want to develop something that's effective, but if it's not implemented, or if it's implemented inconsistently, or that it can't be sustained, it's only done for a week, is that, that you can do it once off, but then trying to integrate it into your practice is a whole other level. You're still going to have sort of poor outcomes. We also know, though, that evidence is not enough for something to automatically happen, and there's many interventions out there that are not effective, and they're implemented as well, and that obviously can cause harm. There's a lot of examples like in pharmacy, where there's medications that are highly prescribed or in health, that, so there's another field developing within implementation science around de-implementation. Taking the principles and how do we get rid of programs that are not effective, so we've got space to put in effective ones. And And that's obviously, you can see that in social service sectors as well, with how the new programs are thrown in all the time, without evidence often, because it's just a change in policy or a new government, and they just get piled on top of each other. They're stripped back, so de-implement the ineffective ones and have some core effective ones. So that's something that's sort of, in the last few years, has become sort of very much a topic, is de-implementation as well. This is one of the quotes I like. The state of the science, what researchers collectively know, and the state of the art, so what practitioners actually do, they coexisted more or less autonomously, each realm of activity having less effect on the other. So we had researchers, we had practitioners, very little sort of contact in between. And this is illustrated with the phases of research and where funding has been sort of put up until now. It's primarily in the first one, we were around defining a service, a program, an intervention, and having it evaluated. Efficacy and effectiveness, maybe cost effectiveness, all still within this first arrow. Then we sort of thought, great, we've got all the evidence, this is fantastic, our work's done, let's do and develop something new. These scenarios don't just occur. You know, the communication out there, so we started, you can see that grant funding now often requires a knowledge translation plan or a dissemination plan, sometimes they're starting to call it implementation plans. It's not that you're right that you're going to publish, present at some conferences. That's still really diffusion. It's not targeted, it's not directed, it's not active in any form. And at best you're going to get to the fact that somebody knows about it. There's still a whole other one about applying it and actually having people put it into their practice. And you can study each one of these separately. So we're seeing that what I'm sort of focusing on, there is gaps really between all of them, but this big gap between what people know and what they're doing in practice and having it sustained in practice. The other part is integrating. So when implementation science sort of kicked off, this was sort of a typical thing. We need to add on implementation at the end. Now there's a lot more talk around really implementation principles should be at the development phase. So because we can't develop interventions without thinking about sustainability, because if we're not thinking about it, we're going to develop things that are far too complicated, or maybe they involve getting data that's not possible in the real world. So you're still not going to reach the end of the line. So the principles need to be involved across the whole thing. I'm not going to go through this. Is one of the many frameworks and models, very new one actually. A group actually in Adelaide as well, a lot of researchers overseas. It's funny, LSE in Kitson and Adelaide. But the idea is this is using network theory, that we have all these different key processes, you know, needs assessment, creating, you know, guidelines, for example, knowledge creation, implementation, evaluation, and the synthesis, and all these different sectors. And we need bridges between them, probably working at the same time. So she put in the paper a few examples, often in sort of like crises, how this can happen very fast if like you have like a natural disaster, for example, where all these different sectors come together and there's bridges between them to have something occur, but it's not occurring normally. So she was coming at it from a complexity and network sort of theory point of view, but saying all these sectors, yes, they sort of sit on their own in some ways, but we need to have bridges and between them to work so things can happen. So terminology. Diffusion is around letting it happen, so that's a passive process where it's sort of a horizontal spread, so like I said, presenting at a conference or a mass mailing of something. Dissemination is helping it happen, so it's more targeted, so it's a targeted distribution of information to a specific audience or around a specific problem. So these are both still around the communication aspect and trying to increase that awareness. So with dissemination research, it's sort of coming up now with thinking around, if you use, say, even like a story, that's going to resonate only with some people and not other people. You have to work out your audience and have different messages to try to reach a broader audience. And they're using this, you know, politicians even thinking about this, that, you know, trying to get policies into practice, that you need to, same evidence, I'm not saying you're changing the evidence-based practice or what's there, but how you voice that message shouldn't be the same to everybody. So that's the idea of dissemination. Whereas implementation is making it happen. So implementation practice, they're trying to distinguish now practice versus the science. Because implementation practice is the use of strategies to adopt. So when someone decides they want to do something, and integrate it into their settings, they have to change their ways of doing things. Which goes to implementation science, which is the study of the methods to promote that introduction and integration into healthcare policy and practice. They're obviously very linked to the implementation practice and the implementation science, and the conferences often have people who are researchers, because the idea you need to have the researchers together with the people trying to do it in practice, or at least the intermediaries who are promoting that evidence-based practice out there. We've got some of the objectives of implementation science. It really is like clinical effectiveness, but around implementation. So it's to study or to understand the mechanisms required to improve implementation success. Understand the processes and the factors that are associated with successful integration. You know, attitudes, climate, motivation are some of the factors that will affect implementation. So understand what they are. And the overall is to support the innovative approaches to identifying, understanding and overcoming the barriers to different stages: adoption, adaptation, integration and overall scale-up, so reach to the population. You can see from that where it's sort of come from and why someone's going to look at this same as improvement science, it's not the same as change management. In many ways, yes, but because of the different levels it draws it all together in some ways. It's not different. We often have these fields sitting side by side, but it uses all the different disciplines. As I say, you have people who have come from different backgrounds, now working within implementation science. Because of the different levels, you're looking at behavioural change, organisational change, network theories, system theories, complexity theories. They all fit within, so you have to look at what lens you're wanting to use. And there is a lot of similarities with continuous quality improvement, doing incremental changes, some of the quality improvement, the big ones like Six Sigma and lean thinking. There is a lot of parallels. Change management, organisational change, behavioural science. There are similarities and there's sort of distinctions, but they often sit with it. We're looking at some papers trying to compare, so we don't just completely go off on the side. We may as well continue to learn from each other. So the growth implementation science, so really around, it started with the diffusion of innovations, Rogers' theory, around in 1943. But as far as the sort of take-up and the popularity, I'd say, in implementation science, around the year 2000, 2001, it started to really have a trajectory, and people focusing on the terminology started to be developed. And when it has started over these last sort of almost 20 years, what sort of happened was initially there was the lack of uniform terminology. People didn't know what were implementation research questions. There wasn't any capacity in the field, both from practitioner point of view and from researchers. There wasn't really any career opportunities to be in implementation because there wasn't the funding for implementation. However, all of these basically have changed in a very short period of time. Research publications were primarily commentaries saying we have a problem. There's a lot of acknowledgement around the implementation problem, but there weren't studies, actual sort of controlled trials around implementation and developing measures and actual research studies and things. That's completely changed. There's journals. Implementation Science is the primary implementation journal, and the impact factor keeps going up as well, just sort of as a sign of how much it's increasing. And you can publish even study protocols in there now and things. So the type of research publication has really changed in that period of time as well. And it's probably harder now to publish a commentary. You need to actually do an actual study rather than just say we've got this issue of my thoughts on something. And the research agenda around funding. So as I say, we do have some schemes that are specific for implementation, scale up and things, but it's still growing. And I'll show you a hybrid design, which is one useful sort of methodology at this stage, where there's less funding for specific implementation research, but it's certainly on the radar, and it's sort of changing quite rapidly. And And certainly, you can look at the US funding, there's a lot of pure implementation now being funded because they're seeing the impact of that kind of work. And it's actually having to change from the other fields' work as well to at least incorporate implementation as well. So a little bit more on terminologies to make it really sort of set home the differences. So if you're looking at clinical effectiveness or health services research, you're trying to understand the processes and the factors associated with somebody's health. Implementation research, you're trying to understand the processes and factors associated with implementation. Which means health services research, you're looking at a clinical intervention, maybe a policy, a service, really any innovation. Implementation research, you're looking at the strategy to get that into practice. That is the intervention that you're studying. We talk about the determinants or the factors with health services. So what changes somebody's behaviour? We've got the ecological models of changing people's behaviour. We've got exactly the same in implementation research. So we've got the different levels and the determinants that change a provider's behaviour. That's influenced by multiple different levels and factors. And that's what we're studying in implementation research. And at the end, it's the end user. So with health services, it's the patient primarily, or the client in the field, whereas an implementation researcher is the implementer or the provider. So that's the focus of the change. And that's where the terminology as far as papers becomes difficult if people use intervention meaning implementation intervention, or some people use obviously intervention meaning the clinical intervention. So I sort of try to be clear by always saying implementation strategy or clinical intervention or using innovation and then strategy, but trying to be distinguished between the two fields because they often, you're talking about implementing something here through an implementation strategy. So initially, particularly some of the older papers, when this wasn't as clear, it takes quite a while to work out which part are they talking about. So I think thinking about it like this really helps when reading the implementation literature. But drilling home just the emphasis, the difference, which I think I've just sort of pointed out a few times now, is clinical effectiveness is the innovation. And so what you're trying to measure or you're developing a model for or evaluate is often the economic, the humanistic, the clinical outcomes of that innovation. Pure implementation research, you're looking at an implementation strategy. You're trying to improve the quality, the quantity, or the efficiency of delivering something by evaluating reach. How many people is it getting to? The fidelity. I'll come to the implementation outcomes in a moment. Fidelity, but like, is it being delivered as it was designed? That's fidelity. And if we don't know that, how do we know it's going to produce the outcomes that was actually developed as well? So we really should be looking at fidelity. And integration. Is it part of someone's practice? Is it the support and the capacity in the setting? So that's sort of the outcomes that you're looking at with implementation. This is one of the other many models out there around implementation outcomes primarily, which is the effect of the deliberate and purposeful actions to implement new treatments. So in normal research, we would look at the intervention, so the evidence-based practice, and then look at the effect right at the end there. We look at the two extremes. How there's many parts in the middle that can mediate or moderate that effect. And that's where we're sort of focusing on. You've got the different levels of the implementation strategies. You might be trying to target the system, the policy, also funding, a law. You might be trying to have an organisational strategy, trying to improve like the buy-in from executives, for example, group learning, so team-based interventions, supervision, clinical supervision or coaching, or trying to change behavioural change strategies as well. So there's a lot of different implementation strategies out there, and generally we know that we have to look across the levels, not just at one. But the thing here is really around these implementation outcomes as well, is that we can look at, there is now developed validated scales for feasibility, acceptability, the quality that it's being delivered at, penetration, how many people have taken this up, or how many patients are receiving it, whether it's sustained. The difference between uptake and fidelity, uptake is how many decide they want to do it, and they're going to do it. So So there's another level there. That's a nice easy one, how many people actually sign up to something. Then the next level is measuring whether they actually do the thing afterwards. And costs here is implementation costs, something that really wasn't included either in initially. We'd look at cost effectiveness over here around cost of just the intervention or the program, but not the cost of actually training people or having a coach go out to train people on site for 6 months. And we should, ideally have that included in the models as well. This is a nice breakdown of the different parts and how they all link into each other. Was it quote, the main take home, individuals cannot benefit from interventions they do not receive. That's the sort of take home message of it all. I thought, we are filming, but if anyone has any questions at this point before we go on. Okay, keep going. We'll go on to the key core components of implementation. So implementation is impacted by what's going to be implemented, so the characteristics of the actual innovation or policy, where and for whom it's going to be implemented, so the context, and how and by whom is it going to be implemented, so the actual facilitation or the implementation strategies. You can see that the bottom here, this is another framework where they say these are multiplications, so if any one of these is 0, you're not going to end up with significant outcomes. You can't just ignore. If you don't have an enabling context at all, you're never going to end up with significant outcomes. And this actually is a great sort of group of frameworks for implementation practice. A lot of sort of hand tools with that group. In North Carolina, you've actually got worksheets that you can plan implementation and how to develop implementation teams, how to do measurements. So it's quite a user-friendly, I would say, group of implementation frameworks, targeting more so implementation practitioners than researchers, as cut drivers, not as such. But that's one of their take-homes, is this one here. So putting that into an actual implementation framework is, so within this, each one of these has their own frameworks, but the core parts of implementation is that we have an innovation, something we're trying to implement, into this multi-level context. This occurs through a process of implementation, which is not a one-off event, it's a process of different stages that we'll go through. So each one of these levels, at each stage, is influenced by a number of factors, which you try to change with some strategies, and you try to evaluate. The things that we need to think about, and there's different frameworks for each one of these parts, or there's some that are sort of overarching as well. But if we think about all these different things, will influence implementation. That's why it becomes messy, why there's so many different theories that get thrown into the mix. So what is to be implemented? It could be anything. Generally, implementation science was developed around evidence-based practices, trying to get things that put evidence into practice, but it can be applied to a new technology, a program, a way of working. So evidence-based practice is a concept rather than a specific one. So that was talked about a lot in nursing, where they wanted nurses to have meetings regularly to look at the research, to change more quality improvement cycles. Of course, research utilisation was what they would be determining it. So it's a concept of a way of working. It's constantly updating the way you do things. It could be that as well. The characteristics is obviously going to influence every stage of implementation. Whether someone decides they want to actually use something new, so whether they're just going to adopt it, that's going to be influenced by the characteristics of the innovation. How long it takes to plan something. Is it simple or is it complicated? That's going to be influenced by the characteristics of the innovation. Is it integrated into practice? Again, the different parts of it. Is it very costly? Does it take a lot of time? Does it require follow-up? That's going to influence whether it's actually used in practice. And similarly with sustainability, whether it's kept going, the characteristics of the innovation itself. So we do need to think about how we develop these things. A big debate is around, should innovations be delivered exactly as they were designed, so with fidelity, or should they be able to be adapted in practice, because every context is different. The end users are different. So if you're working in the Aboriginal sector primarily, it's a very different demographic for an innovation, and the messaging should be targeted, because otherwise, as we spoke about, that's not going to happen, it's not going to work unless it is. So originally, evidence-based practice thought fidelity. We needed to deliver things as it was designed and intended, because otherwise we don't know what's going to have the impact at the end. That's all that's being tested. But implementation, people say, but if you're not getting it implemented into practice, then you're not going to have the outcomes anyway. So we need to adapt it. So the thought now is ideally when people do develop new practices, is you designate what are the core parts, what are the core components of this intervention, and what's the adaptable periphery that can be changed. Maybe that core components is just some principles of practice, and you can adapt all the other parts around it, or maybe it's bigger than that. But that's ideally what would happen, is you knew what parts actually have to be put into practice and what parts can be changed. But without doubt, really, implementation at scale, adaptation is needed. You have to provide people that ability to adapt it. So designing implementable innovations, I sort of covered this, is that there's the contextual levels, you have to think about that. Involving stakeholders is becoming more and more, known. In our funding, we have to involve consumers as sort of a big push at the moment, but it's across. You need stakeholder analysis to work out who are the key players to have at the table right at the beginning. So using some of these collaborative research methodologies, such as like intervention mapping, where together you have a group of people deciding on what's the need to start with, and then developing the intervention and following it through. And ideally, you would also use the same methods for designing the implementation strategy, but it can become obviously a long process. The key being designing with sustainment in mind. So thinking about the end goal. But if you're not thinking about that, it's unlikely that something's going to get there. So picture around the other thing, or if you were not to develop with sort of stakeholders. So this is what some researchers sit there and think that they want. They're not very good at writing it up, so they write something and this is what people interpret it as. Someone else that thinks of it in a completely different way. This is how it was produced in the end. Then it was installed, so it was, and this is what the users wanted. They wanted this is what they wanted them, they developed this to start with, and you've got this big mess. So that's what we're trying to avoid, and we're trying to avoid that both with developing innovations and also developing implementation strategies. We need to report both of them in more detail than what we're currently doing. So we have what is to be implemented, and now we have where is it going to be implemented. So we have the multi-level context for implementation, just like we have the social determinants of health, which are what affects someone's health, is at the multi-level. We also have it for implementation, so the individuals who are going to be delivering it, the organisation that they sit within, the local setting, so where that is locally, the neighbourhood, the local doctors, for example, or providers, and then the overall, the large external system. All of these interact and influence implementation. And we'll go through some of the factors that are within that. So that's where it's going to be implemented. The core part then is how and by who with implementation. So how is this going to happen? So I've sort of stated, it's not a single process. It's not a one-off event saying now it's implemented. It's a long process that involves, often we break it down into stages, although it's not necessarily linear. It's sort of an easy way to sort of picture it and at least design a program that might go across the whole process. And there are frameworks that even break it down into steps, which is nice from a practitioner sort of point of view, is having some steps. And as I said, then each stage of it is influenced by the factors and strategies and evaluations. So just one depiction, a broad one, like a lot of the frameworks have around 4 phases, but they all vary obviously. But you start with an organisation or a provider deciding whether they want to take something up. So they're making that decision whether to adopt it or not. So they make that decision, and that's often termed as an implementation outcome as uptake or adoption. Then they need to prepare, so you must prepare all your staff, training, funding, getting buy-in, all that ideally initially, not just jumping into doing it, having a real plan, workflow, some policies, some processes, all in that preparation stage. You can go back It's not that you have to do all that before. You might have a testing phase and then go back to preparation, but not jumping, is thought of as at least preferred. Another sort of point that can be measured then is that once they're prepared, when they start delivering it, they move to the next phase of operation, which is the process of commencing to use the innovation in practice. Over a long period of time, that one can take a very long time to stay there before you'd actually say you're in sustainment, because we know trying to integrate something is an awkward process. It's easy to do it for a while. It's far easier though to revert back to your old way of doing something. So 2 to 4 years, they say, probably to implement something. Just, talking about funding and the difficulty of all this. Different definitions we're trying to sort of come up with, as I said, at the moment, a measure for sustainment. It's normally defined as either continued delivery after funding ceased or after the implementation strategy stopped, that they keep doing it. It's one sort of breakdown on when you're in sustainment, and that there's ongoing capacity and support in the system. So I said that there, and if it's ever discontinued, you sort of go back to the beginning. These are all, as I say, crossover. You can jump from having it sustained and for whatever reason, if only one person was trained, for example, and they leave, maybe something back in preparation because no one's delivering it anymore. So there's reasons why you jump between. And as now at each one of the stages, we've got the innovation, we've got the context, and we've got the process. They're influenced by these 3 elements. So we have framework, or lists of all the different factors that influence implementation, and these can be quite good for in the preparation stage, some interviews or some qualitative work to determine in that context what are the main barriers to implementation, and then you can tailor strategies accordingly. So they're called implementation factors. They can affect something positively or negatively. So if it's negative, it's a barrier. If it's positive, it's a facilitator or an enabler. And then you can use that to try to increase the implementation. But working out in a setting what are the factors that are primary ones, and then trying to address them or use them. And as I say, there's quite a few. The Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, the CFA, is one that I use a lot around just a list of different factors that can be used to code. And here's some of the factors at the different levels. You can see the characteristics of the innovation, the different things that might affect behaviourally, organisation, the local setting, demographics of acceptance awareness, the network within that, and the system, policy legislation, guidelines and tools. So many different things that can affect the implementation process, and you try to target a few of these with your implementation strategies. So these are targeted towards the factors to try to improve implementation more or less. And again, there's now lists of strategies like this, breaking down the different strategies and what level it's affecting, and you can use these, but we won't go through that in detail. There's quite a few different ones. The final part is evaluations. So this is indicators of the movement through the stages. So I said that as we went through the process, that you can sort of quantitatively say how many people turned up to, let's say, the first lecture, how many people were aware of it, how many then actually signed up at the end. That's your level of uptake or adoption, and then you can look at how many actually implemented it, how many people it reached in the end. So this is a model of evaluation. This was the primary part, similar to the other one we looked at. You've got the innovation, so the changes in the patient's behaviour and the overall outcomes. But we can also look at the implementation part. So how many people did it reach? Was it done as it was designed and intended? So the level of provision, and also the level of the provider. Is it integrated into their practice? And is there support there? So you need all this to really go into sustainment and move along. But also you can obviously measure the implementation factors, just as you measure the patient's sort of behavioural change factors. You can measure acceptance or attitudes, for example, and the process. I won't go through that one. People might have heard of REAIM, but it's a very simplified version of measuring, and it includes effectiveness. So this is what you do in a hybrid design study. You're still looking at effectiveness, but you're also looking at how many people it reached, how many people took it up, implementation factors, and that it was sustained. And the implication is, if you're trying to sort of develop a study or something, is that you can sort of start developing models of what you're wanting to test and different levels that it might occur at. So you might have some implementation strategies to get buy-in of executive management attitudes so that they take it up. But them taking it up doesn't mean it's going to go down to a practitioner using it here. So you might have to have some strategies also at the team level and measure the implementation climate. So there is a measure of implementation climate, a scale for that. And then you can also have tests at the beginning, either quantitatively or qualitatively, what are the providers' attitudes. So we just compared attitudes recently of Native American and Alaskan Natives and Native Americans, their attitudes towards evidence-based practice in substance use treatment centres versus the providers for non-Native Americans. And they're different. You know, they are less open to evidence-based practice because it doesn't fit their sort of belief system. And it is more divergent. It diverges more from what their current practice is. So that's, you know, interesting to know. If you know that, then you can have strategies to try to influence that. So you can do that, and then there's also a measure of intentions, which is a sort of, if you can't measure use, you've got intentions. So recap, final one is 6 core concepts of implementation is that it involves an innovation, something you're trying to implement across a multi-level context. It's a long, multi-stage process, and it's influenced by practice strategies and evaluations, and there's frameworks for all these different parts. I can't remember number 3, but we'll do that next time.